On a gray Tuesday morning in October of 2009, Delmar Ostrander stood at the edge of his property line in Saline County, Missouri, and watched a truck back up to his fence for the third time that week. The driver didn't get out. He didn't knock. He just lifted the bed, and a wet, brown, fermented cascade of apple pomace, the pressed-out pulp and skins and cores left over from cider making, slid off the tailgate and landed in a heap against the cedar posts like it had always belonged there. The driver lowered the bed, pulled forward, and was gone before Delmar had finished his coffee. That had been going on since 1997. Let me tell you about what Saline County looked like in those years, because you need to understand the landscape before you can understand what Delmar did with it. Saline County sits in the middle of Missouri, west of Columbia, east of Kansas City, cut through by the Missouri River, and flanked by bottom ground so rich and dark it looks almost black in the rain. Corn and soybean country, mostly. But up in the northern reaches of the county, where the ground rolls a little and the drainage gets complicated, there had been apple orchards since before the Civil War. Not many, maybe a dozen operations of any size by the time Delmar was born, but enough that a small regional cannery had set up outside the town of Marshall in 1961, processing cider and applesauce and apple butter for grocery chains across the Midwest. The cannery ran from August through November every year, and in those 4 months it pressed an almost incomprehensible volume of apples, and every apple that went through the press left behind a wet, fibrous, slightly fermented mass of pomace that the cannery had to dispose of. For the first 20 years, they paid to haul it to a landfill. Then, in the early 1980s, a new plant manager calculated what that was costing and decided there was a cheaper solution. He started calling local farmers and offering to dump it on their fields as a soil amendment. Some farmers took the deal. The pomace was mildly acidic, high in fiber, and broke down reasonably well. It wasn't harmful, it just wasn't particularly useful either, and it smelled like a hard cider brewery for about 3 weeks every fall, which made it unpopular with anyone who had neighbors close enough to complain. Most of the farmers who tried it once didn't invite the cannery back. Delmar Ostrander invited them back every year for 12 years. Let me tell you about Delmar, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he was looking at when that truck pulled away. Delmar was 61 years old in 2009. He had farmed the same 280 acres in Saline County for 38 years, having taken over from his father in 1971 when the old man's knees gave out and he couldn't climb onto a tractor without help anymore. The land was good land mostly, corn and soybeans like everyone else in the county, with a small hay operation on the rougher ground near the creek. Delmar had never gotten rich off it, but he'd never lost it either, which in farm country is its own kind of accomplishment. He drove a 1994 Ford pickup with 210,000 miles on it and saw no reason to replace it. He wore canvas work jackets in the fall and flannel in the winter, and the same brand of work boots he'd been buying since 1983. He was not a man who changed things without a reason, but Delmar Ostrander was also, and this is the part that matters, a reader. Not of novels or newspapers, though he read those too. He was a reader of agricultural bulletins, university extension publications, USDA research summaries, and the kind of dense, practical scientific literature that most farmers glance at and set aside. He had a shelf in his shop, not his house, his shop, lined with 3-ring binders full of photocopied journal articles going back to the 1970s. His wife, Connie, used to joke that he was the only man in Saline County who read for fun and still had grease under his fingernails. She wasn't wrong, and Delmar had been reading about vinegar. Not the kind of reading you do when you're curious about something. The kind you do when you've been looking at a problem for a long time, and you think you might have found the answer. He'd started in 2003 when he came across a short piece in a university extension newsletter about traditional apple cider vinegar production and its commercial revival in natural food markets. He'd filed it in a binder and kept reading. By 2007, he had accumulated material on acetobacter fermentation, on the Orleans method of slow surface fermentation, on the difference between commercially produced vinegar, which is made in 24 hours via forced aeration, and traditionally produced raw apple cider vinegar, which takes months and produces a product with measurably different chemistry. He had a folder of market research he'd pulled from trade publications about the natural food industry, about Whole Foods markets expanding private label and specialty supplier programs, about the growing consumer demand for unpasteurized, unfiltered, raw, fermented products. He had been looking at that pile of Pomace against his fence for 6 years before he decided what to do with it. Let me tell you about the science, because Delmar understood it, and you should too. Apple Pomace, the pressed pulp left after cider extraction, still contains somewhere between 2 and 4% residual sugar, depending on the apple variety and how thoroughly the press extracted the juice. That sugar is fermentable. In traditional vinegar production, the process has 2 stages. First, yeast converts the residual sugars to alcohol, producing a weak apple wine or cider. Second, acetobacter bacteria, which occur naturally in the environment and are present in any raw fermented apple product, convert that alcohol to acetic acid, which is vinegar. The slow surface method, the Orleans method developed in France in the 17th century, allows this second fermentation to proceed at its own pace in open vessels, producing a vinegar with a complex flavor profile and what the industry calls the mother, a living culture of acetobacter bacteria that remains suspended in the finished product and is itself a significant selling point in the natural food market. Commercial vinegar producers skip most of this. They use clarified apple juice, not pomace. They force aeration through the fermenting liquid to accelerate acetobacter activity, reducing a months-long process to a matter of hours. They pasteurize the finished product, killing the mother. They produce a consistent, shelf-stable, inexpensive product that tastes like vinegar and nothing else. What they do not produce is what Delmar was reading about in those trade publications. The kind of raw, unfiltered, unpasteurized apple cider vinegar that was starting to appear on Whole Foods shelves at $6 to $8 a bottle in the mid-2000s, made by small producers in Vermont and Oregon who were charging a premium that the industrial producers couldn't touch. Not because they lacked the apples, but because they lacked the time and the patience and the willingness to let the process work at its own pace. Delmar had time. He had patience. And he had, sitting against his fence in a heap that the Cannery had been delivering free of charge for 12 years, more raw fermentation feedstock than most small vinegar producers could dream of. He had been accepting that pomace deliberately since 1997. He had been composting the majority of it, yes, but he had also been, quietly and without telling anyone, running small batches of experimental fermentation in repurposed food-grade barrels in the back corner of his shop. Not to make vinegar he could sell, to understand the process, to learn the chemistry in his hands, not just in his binders. He'd made bad batches and good batches, and batches that went sideways in ways he didn't expect, and he'd written down everything that happened and why he thought it happened and what he'd do differently. By 2007, he had a notebook, a separate notebook from the binders, handwritten, specific to his own fermentation trials, that was 140 pages long. He had never shown it to anyone. Now, let me tell you about the morning in March of 2010 when Delmar Ostrander drove into Marshall and walked into the offices of the Saline County Farm Bureau. Because that morning is the reason this story exists, and it is not a comfortable story to tell. The Farm Bureau office in Marshall was the kind of place where the agricultural establishment of the county gathered, formally and informally. The director at the time was a man named Chuck Hodges, and Chuck Hodges had been the Farm Bureau director for 16 years, and before that had been a county extension agent for 9 years, and before that had managed his family's 1,200-acre corn and soybean operation, and he was, in the estimation of most of the county, the man who knew agriculture in Saline County better than anyone alive. He was 64 years old, broad-shouldered, with the particular confidence of a man who has been right about most things for most of his life, and has stopped distinguishing between that record and infallibility. He held court at the Farm Bureau office the way a judge holds court in a courtroom, with the assumption that the proceedings were his to run. Delmar had an appointment. He had made it 3 weeks earlier, which was unusual. Most farmers just walked in. The fact that Delmar had scheduled a meeting meant he had something to say, and Chuck Hodges had been curious enough about that to clear his calendar for an hour. Delmar sat down across from Chuck's desk, set his notebook on the table, and explained what he wanted to do. He wanted to build a small-scale fermentation facility on his property. He wanted to process the apple Pomace the cannery had been delivering into raw apple cider vinegar using traditional slow fermentation methods. He wanted to pursue a specialty food license from the state of Missouri. He wanted to approach Whole Foods Market's regional buying office in St. Louis about a potential supplier relationship. He had done the market research. He had done the fermentation trials. He had the feedstock. He wanted to know if the Farm Bureau had any resources or connections that might help him get started. He laid out his notebook on the desk. Chuck Hodges looked at the notebook the way you look at something that doesn't belong where it is. Then he looked at Delmar. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, "Del, you're 62 years old." Delmar said he was 61. "You're going to build a vinegar factory on your farm and sell it to Whole Foods." Delmar said that was the plan. Chuck Hodges made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, but contained elements of both. He said the natural food market was a fad, that the big producers had vinegar covered, that the specialty food business required marketing and distribution infrastructure that a single farmer in Saline County was not going to build from scratch, and that Delmar's time and money would be better spent on what he knew. He said it not unkindly. He said it the way a man says something he believes is true and considers it a favor to say it plainly. He pushed the notebook back across the desk without opening it. "The cannery's been dumping waste on your fence for 12 years, Chuck said. "That's not a business opportunity. That's a nuisance you've been too polite to stop." The silence in that office lasted about 4 seconds. Delmar picked up his notebook, thanked Chuck Hodges for his time, and left. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone be dismissed by a person who was holding the wrong map? Chuck Hodges was not a stupid man. He was not a cruel man. He had genuine expertise in conventional Midwestern grain agriculture and a real record of helping farmers in Saline County navigate difficult years. But he was looking at Delmar Ostrander's idea through the lens of what he knew, and what he knew was corn and soybeans and commodity markets, and none of that had anything to do with what Delmar was proposing. The map Chuck was reading was accurate. It just wasn't a map of the territory Delmar was standing in. Delmar understood this. He had understood it before he walked in. He had gone to the Farm Bureau, not because he needed Chuck Hodges' permission, but because he had wanted to try the conventional channel first, on the theory that it was better to have institutional support than not. Now he knew he didn't have it. That was useful information. He drove home, changed into his work clothes, and started drawing plans for a fermentation shed. Let me tell you about the next 18 months, because they are the part of this story that most people never see. The part that happens before there is anything to look at. Delmar spent the spring and the summer of 2010 converting a 40 by 60 foot outbuilding on the east side of his property into what he called, without irony, the Ostrander Fermentation Works. He did most of the construction himself, with help from his son-in-law, a carpenter named Pete Bontrager, who thought the whole project was either brilliant or insane, and wasn't sure which but showed up every Saturday anyway. They insulated the building for temperature stability, installed a floor drain and a water line, built a ventilation system out of salvaged components, and constructed a series of wooden fermentation racks from white oak lumber that Delmar had sourced from a sawmill in Howard County. He bought 30 food-grade oak barrels, used from a winery in Hermann, Missouri, that was upgrading its cooperage. He paid $18 a barrel. He cleaned and inspected every one of them himself. He did not take out a loan. He used savings. The total construction and equipment cost, by the time the building was operational in September of 2010, was $14,200. He had budgeted $15,000 and came in under. The cannery delivered its first load of the season in late August, as it always did, and for the first time in 12 years, Delmar was waiting for it. He directed the driver to back up to a new concrete pad he had poured beside the fermentation building rather than the fence line, and the driver, who had been making this run for 4 years and had never once seen Delmar show any particular interest in the Pomace, gave him a look that was equal parts confusion and mild alarm. Delmar told him where to put it. The driver put it there and left. Delmar loaded the first barrels that evening. The fermentation process he used was not complicated, but it required patience that most commercial producers had engineered out of their operations decades earlier. He mixed the Pomace with well water in a ratio he had worked out over 3 years of trials, added a small amount of active mother culture he had been maintaining since 2006, covered the barrels with cheesecloth to allow air exchange while excluding debris, and set the temperature in the building to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, which he had determined through his trials to be the optimal range for his particular Acetobacter culture. Then he waited. He checked the barrels daily. He recorded pH, temperature, and sensory observations in a log that he maintained with the same discipline he applied to his field records. He did not rush the process. He did not aerate artificially. He let the bacteria do what bacteria had been doing to apple juice for thousands of years before anyone decided to speed it up. The first batch took 4 months and 3 weeks to reach the acidity level he was targeting. 5.2% acetic acid, which he measured with a titration kit he had ordered from a laboratory supply company. He filtered it through cheesecloth, leaving the mother intact, bottled it in 16-ounce amber glass bottles he had sourced from a packaging supplier in St. Louis, and labeled it by hand with a label he and Connie had designed at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon. The label said, Ostrander Raw Apple Cider Vinegar, Salem County, Missouri, unfiltered, unpasteurized, small batch. It had a simple line drawing of an apple that Connie had sketched herself. He made 340 bottles from the first batch. He drove to St. Louis in February of 2011 with 12 bottles in a cardboard box on the passenger seat of his 1994 Ford and asked for a meeting with the Whole Foods regional specialty buyer. Let me tell you about what happened in that meeting, because it is not the story you might expect. The buyer's name was a woman named Renata, and she had been sourcing specialty food products for Whole Foods for 7 years. And she had seen a great many farmers and small producers walk through her door with products they believed were exceptional and businesses that were not yet ready for what Whole Foods required. She was polite and efficient, and she had a system. She opened one of Delmar's bottles, smelled it, tasted it, and set it down. She asked him about his production volume, his food safety certifications, his labeling compliance, his liability insurance, and his capacity to supply 12 stores consistently. Delmar answered every question. Some answers were good. Some answers revealed gaps he would need to close. Renata wrote things down and told him she would be in touch. He drove home. She called 3 weeks later. She told him the product was exceptional, genuinely exceptional, not the polite exceptional she used to let people down gently. She told him the flavor profile was unlike anything in their current Missouri supplier portfolio. She told him she wanted to bring it to a regional buyer review in April, and that if it cleared the review, she could offer him a trial placement in 4 St. Louis area stores, with the understanding that he would need to have his food safety documentation in order and his production capacity confirmed before the first order shipped. Delmar said he understood. He hung up the phone and sat in his shop for a long time looking at the fermentation barrels. Now let me tell you about the spring and summer of 2011, because this is when the story became visible to people in Saline County who had not been paying attention to what was happening on Delmar Ostrander's farm. He had to scale up. 4 stores meant a consistent supply, and consistent supply meant more barrels, more Pomace management, and a food safety infrastructure that his current operation didn't fully have. He applied for a Missouri cottage food license, then discovered that his production volume exceeded cottage food limits, and he needed a full specialty food manufacturer's license instead. He hired a food safety consultant from Columbia for 2 days to help him build a HACCP plan. Hazard analysis and critical control points, the documentation framework required for commercial food production. He paid for a third-party laboratory to test 3 batches for acidity, pH, and microbial safety. Every test came back clean. He added 12 more barrels, bringing his total to 42, and reconfigured the fermentation building to accommodate the expanded capacity. He also, for the first time, told people in Saline County what he was doing. The reaction was not uniformly supportive. Word traveled the way word travels in small agricultural communities, through the co-op, through the coffee counter at the feed store, through the Farm Bureau meetings that Delmar still attended because he was a member and saw no reason to stop being one. Most people were curious in a neutral way. A few were genuinely encouraging, and some, including Chuck Hodges, were skeptical in a way that had curdled slightly since March of 2010, because now Delmar wasn't just proposing something unusual, he was actually doing it, and that made the skepticism feel more urgent. Chuck Hodges said at a Farm Bureau meeting in June of 2011 that he hoped Delmar knew what he was getting into with the specialty food business, that the regulatory burden alone was enough to sink a small operation, and that he had heard the Whole Foods relationship was more complicated than it looked from the outside. He said this in the general way of a man raising concerns for the benefit of the group, not addressing Delmar directly, though Delmar was sitting 8 feet away. Delmar listened. He didn't respond. He wrote a note in the margin of his meeting agenda that said simply, April. The Whole Foods trial placement was confirmed in April of 2011. 4 stores. The first order was for 48 cases of 12 bottles each, 576 bottles, to be delivered to the regional distribution center in June. Delmar had the inventory. He had the documentation. He delivered the order on time in the bed of his 1994 Ford pickup, carefully packed in cardboard cases, each bottle labeled by hand. The 4 stores sold through their initial inventory in 11 days. Renata called him before he had time to call her. She wanted to expand the placement to 8 stores and increase the order volume. She also wanted to discuss whether Ostrander raw apple cider vinegar could be included in Whole Foods' Regional Producer Spotlight program, which would give the product dedicated shelf placement and in-store signage for a 90-day promotional period. Delmar said he needed to think about the volume. He called Pete Bontrager that evening and asked him how many weekends he had free that summer. Let me tell you about the years between 2011 and 2015, because they are the years that built the thing, and they are not glamorous years, but they are the years that matter most in any story like this one. Delmar expanded the fermentation building in the fall of 2011, adding a 20 by 40-foot annex that Pete Bontrager framed in 3 weekends. He brought his barrel count to 94. He renegotiated his arrangement with the Cannery, which had been delivering Pomace to his fence for free as a disposal convenience, and formalized it as a written agreement in which the Cannery continued to deliver at no charge in exchange for Delmar's written acknowledgement that the material met agricultural amendment standards, a legal formality that protected the Cannery and cost Delmar nothing. The Cannery's plant manager, a younger man named Gary, who had taken over in 2008, was quietly delighted. The Pomace disposal problem had been a minor but persistent cost center, and Delmar's arrangement eliminated it entirely. By 2012, Ostrander raw apple cider vinegar was in 14 Whole Foods stores across Missouri and Kansas. By 2013, it was in 22 stores in 4 states. The revenue in 2013 was $187,000. The revenue in 2014 was $261,000. These were not numbers that made Delmar Ostrander wealthy, but they were numbers that made his farm profitable in a way that corn and soybeans alone had never quite managed. And they were numbers that were built on a raw material that had been arriving at his fence for free for 12 years before he decided to do something with it. He had not taken on investors. He had not taken on debt beyond a small equipment line of credit he paid off in 2013. He had not hired anyone full-time until 2014, when he brought on a young woman named Jessie Rasmussen, fresh out of the University of Missouri's Food Science program to manage production quality and documentation. Jessie had applied for the job after reading about Ostrander vinegar in a Missouri agricultural trade publication. She had sent Delmar a 2-page letter explaining her interest in traditional fermentation methods and her coursework in food microbiology. Delmar had called her the day he received the letter and offered her the job before she had time to send a resume. Connie Ostrander had been managing the bookkeeping since the beginning, in addition to her work as a school librarian, and she was the one who told Delmar in the spring of 2014 that they needed to have a conversation about what this business was going to become. They had that conversation at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening, with coffee and a legal pad, and by the end of it they had decided 3 things. They were going to incorporate the business properly. They were going to build a dedicated production facility rather than continuing to expand the converted outbuilding, and they were going to apply for USDA organic certification, which would open a new tier of the market and justify a higher price point. The organic certification process took 14 months. It required documentation of every input into the fermentation process, verification of the pomace source, soil testing on the land where the pomace was composted, and an on-site inspection by a USDA accredited certifying agent. Delmar had records going back to 2006. He had the fermentation logs, the sourcing documentation, the trial notebooks. The certifying agent, a woman who had been doing agricultural inspections for 20 years, told Delmar after her visit that she had never seen a small food producer with more complete records. She said it the way you say something that surprises you. The USDA organic certification was granted in the spring of 2016. Whole Foods repriced the product at $8.99 for the 16-ounce bottle and $14.49 for the 32-ounce. The first month after the organic certification appeared on the label, sales volume increased by 34%. Now, let me tell you about the fall of 2016, because this is when Chuck Hodges came to Delmar Ostrander's farm, and this is the part of the story that I have been building toward since the beginning. It was a Saturday in October, the same month of year that Delmar had been watching the cannery truck dump pomace against his fence for so many years. The leaves on the cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow, and the air had that particular Midwest October quality. Cold enough to see your breath in the morning, warm enough by afternoon to work without a jacket. Delmar was in the fermentation building checking barrel temperatures when he heard a truck pull into the yard. He came out and saw Chuck Hodges standing beside his pickup, looking at the new production facility. A purpose-built 60 by 80-foot metal building with a concrete apron and a loading dock and the Ostrander Fermentation Works sign above the door, with an expression that was hard to read from a distance. Delmar walked over. They shook hands. Chuck said the place looked good. Delmar said thank you. There was a silence of the kind that happens between two men who have unfinished business and are deciding how to approach it. Chuck said he had been reading about the Whole Foods relationship in the agricultural press. He said he had heard about the organic certification. He said he had a nephew, a younger farmer over in Pettis County, who had been approached by a specialty food broker about developing a value-added product from his apple operation, and Chuck wasn't sure how to advise him, and he thought maybe Delmar might be willing to talk to the nephew. Delmar looked at Chuck Hodges for a moment. He said, "Chuck, do you remember what you told me in your office in March of 2010? Chuck said he remembered the meeting. You told me the cannery had been dumping waste on my fence for 12 years. You said that wasn't a business opportunity. You said it was a nuisance I'd been too polite to stop." Chuck was quiet. "I want you to understand something," Delmar said. "I'm not telling you that to embarrass you. I'm telling you because your nephew needs to hear what I'm about to say, and I want you to understand where it comes from." He paused. "The Pomace was never the nuisance. The pomace was the business. I just had to be patient enough to figure out what it wanted to become." He invited Chuck inside. They spent 2 hours in the fermentation building, and Delmar showed Chuck every stage of the process: the pomace intake, the barrel loading, the fermentation monitoring, the bottling line, the quality documentation. He showed him the laboratory notebooks going back to 2006. He showed him the Whole Foods purchase orders, the organic certification paperwork, the revenue figures for 2015 and 2016. He answered every question Chuck asked, and Chuck asked a great many questions, and by the end of it, Chuck Hodges had the expression of a man who has been carrying a wrong assumption for a long time and has just set it down. Before Chuck left, he said, "I should have opened that notebook." Delmar said, "Yes, you should have." Then he said, "Bring your nephew by next month. I'll walk him through it." Let me tell you about what happened in the years after that, because the story doesn't end in 2016, and it doesn't end with Chuck Hodges' visit, though that visit was its own kind of conclusion. Chuck's nephew, a young man named Isaac Vandermeer, who farmed 180 acres in Pettis County and had a small apple orchard his grandfather had planted in the 1950s, came to the Ostrander farm in November of 2016 with a legal pad and a lot of questions. Delmar spent most of a Saturday with him. He showed him the fermentation process, gave him copies of the food safety documentation templates Jesse Rasmussen had developed, and connected him with the USDA organic certification agent who had certified Ostrander's operation. He did not charge Isaac for any of this. He did not ask for anything in return. He said simply that he had figured this out by reading and experimenting for a long time, and there was no reason Isaac should have to start from scratch. Isaac Vandermeer launched Vandermeer Heritage Vinegar in 2018. By 2020, he was in 8 specialty food stores in Missouri and Illinois. He called Delmar the day his first Whole Foods order shipped and left a voicemail that Connie Ostrander saved on her phone for years. By 2019, Ostrander Fermentation Works was supplying 67 Whole Foods stores across 8 states. The business employed 4 full-time people, including Jesse Rasmussen, who had become production manager and whose name appeared on the company's food safety certifications alongside Delmar's. The 2019 revenue was $1.4 million. The raw material cost for the primary input, the apple Pomace, was still zero. The Cannery was still delivering it, now under a formal supply agreement that the Cannery's parent company had requested in 2017, when they realized that the Pomace they had been disposing of for free was the primary input in a 7-figure food business. Delmar signed the agreement. The price remained zero. He had leverage he had never needed to use, and he used it only to maintain what had always been true. Let me tell you about the summer of 2021, because this is the part of the story that Delmar himself says he didn't see coming, though in retrospect it seems like the only place the story could have gone. Jesse Rasmussen had been with the company for 7 years. She was 31 years old, and she had spent those 7 years learning fermentation chemistry at the cellular level, documenting every variable in every batch, building a quality system that had produced 0 food safety incidents across 10 years of commercial production. She had also been reading, the same way Delmar read, the same kind of dense, specific scientific literature that most people in the industry didn't bother with. She had been reading about kombucha, about water kefir, about the broader fermented beverage market, and about a specific category that was growing at a rate that made the apple cider vinegar market look modest by comparison. Drinking vinegars and shrubs, the concentrated fruit and vinegar syrups that were appearing in craft cocktail bars and natural food stores as mixers and health tonics. She brought it to Delmar on a Tuesday afternoon in July, the same way Delmar had brought his idea to Chuck Hodges 11 years earlier, with a notebook, with data, with a specific proposal. She had done the market research. She had done the formulation trials using the existing fermentation infrastructure and a small amount of fruit from local orchards. She had 3 sample products ready: a blackberry shrub, a ginger apple shrub, and a tart cherry drinking vinegar. She had pricing models and a projected margin analysis and a conversation she had already had, informally, with Renata's successor at Whole Foods Regional Buying. She set the notebook on Delmar's workbench. Delmar looked at the notebook. He picked it up and opened it. He read the first 4 pages without saying anything. Then he looked at Jessie and said, "How long have you been working on this?" She said, "About 8 months." He nodded slowly. He looked at the 3 sample bottles on the bench. He opened the blackberry shrub, smelled it, poured a small amount into a tasting cup, and drank it. He set the cup down. He was quiet for a moment in the way that he was always quiet when he was thinking something through completely before he spoke. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" Jesse Rasmussen launched the Ostrander shrub line under the Ostrander Fermentation Works label in the spring of 2022. The initial placement was in 14 Whole Food stores. By the end of 2022, the shrub line was outselling the original apple cider vinegar in 3 of those stores. Whole Foods expanded the placement to 31 stores in 2023. Delmar Ostrander was 74 years old. He still came into the fermentation building every morning to check the barrels. He still kept his notebooks. He had started a new one in 2021, this one about traditional European fruit vinegars, raspberry, elderberry, quince, and what the American specialty food market might do with them in the next decade. He had not mentioned it to anyone yet. He was still reading, still accumulating, still waiting for the right moment to understand what the material wanted to become. Let me tell you one last thing, because this story has a shape that I want you to see clearly before it ends. Chuck Hodges retired from the Farm Bureau in 2017. He came to Delmar's farm one more time that fall, not for business, just to visit. They sat in the shop with coffee, the same shop where Delmar had kept his binders and run his early fermentation trials, and they talked for a long time about the county and the farms and the people they had both known for 40 years. Before Chuck left, he said something that Delmar repeated to Connie that evening and that Connie repeated to their daughter, who repeated it to Jesse Rasmussen, who wrote it down in the production log for that day because she thought it belonged somewhere permanent. Chuck said, "I spent 30 years telling farmers what worked. I should have spent more time asking them what they were looking at." Delmar said he thought that was about right. The cannery outside Marshall is still running. It still delivers apple pomace to the Ostrander farm every fall, under the same agreement that has governed the arrangement since 2017, at a cost of $0 per ton. The fermentation building is full of barrels. The notebooks are on the shelf. Jesse Rasmussen is working on something new. Delmar doesn't know exactly what yet, but she has been reading again, the way she reads when she's found something, and he recognizes the look. He's not going to ask her to stop. The pomace arrives every October. The barrels fill. The bacteria do their slow, patient, ancient work. And somewhere in the county, there's probably a man sitting at a desk who would look at all of it and see a nuisance. That's what happens when you've been holding the wrong map for so long, you've forgotten it's a map at all.